top story, because Hope, the situation in Edinburgh that we heard about at the university earlier was not the only issue that you discussed with Ms Wilson.
Yeah, absolutely. We also talked about criminal justice system and in particular the bar for evidence in rape trials. Now, we're going to go through this. We know from official figures that currently 51% of rape trials end in conviction. That's compared to a 91% conviction rate for all trials. Now, in 2020 and 2021, there were almost 2,200 rapes reported to police. 152 people were charged, and of those, 78 were convicted. This week, Miss Wilson published some of the evidence that was used in court. In her case, it's a conversation she recorded between her and Daniel McFarlane after the rape took place.
Do you not get how awful it makes me feel when you say I haven't raped you, when you have, and when you say that I've made up...
We've already established that I have. Yeah, well, the people that I need to believe me.
But they're believing a lie.
And I'll tell them the truth one day. But not today.
Will you tell them the truth about what you've done to me?
Maybe.
How do you feel about it?
I feel good not knowing that I'm in prison.
Well, in the face of it, Hope, damning evidence, but of course not all victims are in such a position with such evidence.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point that Miss Wilson was trying to make. That bar for evidence is incredibly high, and it's really difficult to get a conviction. And she told me a little bit about her experience as well with that.
In my own case, there were obviously guilty verdicts for 2 rapes and for another charge of attempting to defeat the ends of justice. But there was also 2 not provens in my case as well. There was another rape and an assault that were not proven. And of course there's lots of debate around the not proven verdict. And I wonder if, perhaps if that verdict hadn't have been made available, if those would have slid towards guilty as well. But certainly the bar for conviction is so high. And I think it says a lot about the justice system that, I had written confessions, I had an audio confession, and I was still anxious about whether I was going to get a conviction. And the verdict wasn't unanimous as well. You can literally have written proof, a written confession, an audio confession, and not everyone on the jury is going to believe you. And I think that says a lot about society.
So where should the bar for evidence be in rape trials? Should the conviction rate be higher? Well, here to discuss this, Sandy Brindley, the Chief Executive of Rape Crisis Scotland, and the lawyer Thomas Ross Casey. Good evening to you both. Sandy Brindley, your view on the bar for evidence. Do you believe it's too high?
I mean, what we know is that rape has got the lowest conviction rate of any crime type in Scotland, and it can be very, very difficult to get a conviction in cases of this nature. I think there's this view that the legal system is a neutral, objective system that evaluates evidence, and a lack of convictions is because there's insufficient evidence. And I don't know that that is the case. We now have substantial evidence from mock juries looking at the impact of jury attitudes on decision making, and I think there's a real worry about wrongful acquittals in cases of this nature because of attitudes that jury members are bringing to bear on the evidence that they hear.
Well, Thomas Ross, 51% conviction rate in the most recent statistics. This means around about 1,000 cases at that point didn't result in conviction. Yeah. Is that because of the level of evidence that's required?
Well, I don't agree that there is a high bar. That's been said on more than one occasion tonight. I don't agree with that for a second. I mean, there requires to be 2 sources of evidence in relation to the material aspects of the case, and that's all that's required. And then it's perfectly open to the jury to accept that evidence and to convict. 51% is quite a high rate of conviction.
Well, the overall rate for all crimes is somewhere between 86 and 91%, so it's almost half.
Yeah, but I might be conducting a murder case where there are 15 sources of evidence. There's DNA, there's fingerprints, there's CCTV, there's 4 eyewitnesses, there's all of that. In the majority of rape cases, there isn't 12 sources of evidence. In the majority of rape cases, there's 2. So there's absolutely nothing surprising about the fact that the rate of conviction is lower in cases where there are 2 sources of evidence than there is when there are 12.
Well, ultimately, of course, corroboration is one of the issues here, Sandy Brindley, in terms of 2 pieces of evidence to convict. Given that in many of these cases it's one person's word against another, is that something that you think needs to be looked at?
That is certainly not my experience, is that in many of these cases it's one person's word against another. If that was the case wouldn't be in court, because, as you say, we require corroboration of the different elements of a case. I mean, I've seen not proven verdicts in cases where there's been very significant levels of evidence, but still the jury will not convict or are unwilling to convict. And I do think quite often we hear of juries not being unanimous, even where there has been like a very overwhelming amount of evidence. So I think that does take us back to, as our current system, the best way of getting to the truth of what happened in these cases. And I do have real worries about what happens in some jury deliberations in rape cases. And we've been contacted by people who've sat in rape juries who have said to us just how appalled they've been about some of the discussions that have taken place.
And the case that we're talking about tonight is a case in point, as far as the point Sandy's just making there. It wasn't a unanimous verdict, even though the victim had a confession.
Well, I haven't heard the accused side of it. I don't know why it wasn't a unanimous verdict. I don't know. I haven't seen any account given by the accused.
What about Sandy's point more widely about jury deliberations, etc.?
Well, what Sandy refers to is a mock jury study, a very small number of studies which involve people who were not jurors, people who were performing an acting role as jurors, and it provides really no basis for reforming the criminal justice system.
Sandy Brindley?
Well, I mean, there's been international evidence using mock juries, looking at the impact of jury attitudes on deliberations. And Professor Fiona Leverick of Glasgow University published an analysis of the many studies that exist across the world. And what she found was there was overwhelming evidence of rape myths impacting jury deliberations. And what that means is, I suppose, just misassumptions or incorrect notions about how somebody might respond to a rape, how they might react after or during a rape, and also just myths really about what rape is, this enduring notion that it's going to be a stranger, there's going to be lots of physical injury, which we know can happen, but is very, very much in the minority. So I think if we're going to continue to use juries in cases of this nature, I think we need to do much more to make sure that jury members have the information they need to make correct, to really not bring false assumptions to bear on the evidence they're hearing, because I do worry that what we're seeing now is not a fact-finding or truth-finding process.
Sorry, the line's just breaking up to you just a little bit there, Sandy, but we'll see if we can sort that out. Thomas Ross, on the issue of safeguarding on university campuses, we've heard tonight calls for a reintroduction of the system where people have to declare whether they have a conviction or whether they have any proceedings currently active against them. How do you feel about that?
It's an incredibly difficult matter, but one of the stories that hit the headlines last week was a story surrounding a woman in Barrow and Furness in Cumbria who made completely false allegations against a number of young men, was convicted of 7 charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice last week. And one of the young men spent 3 months in custody in relation to allegations which were completely and entirely false. Now, it's bad enough that he spent 3 months in custody. If, in addition, he had been thrown out of university on the basis of false allegations, then that would really have been a tragedy. And I'm not suggesting that that's the case in relation to Miss Wilson's, it's the exact opposite case, but it simply demonstrates what a difficult exercise it is for anybody who has to confront this at the start of the process, because in a society we generally don't punish people until the allegations have been proved against them.
Well, what about that, Sandy Brindley? False allegations and, of course, the presumption of innocence.
I think the presumption of innocence is rightly held very dear in our society. I do think it's important to bear in mind that false allegations of the nature that Thomas Ross refers to there are extremely rare. And in our discussions about improving legal responses to rape, nobody is talking about changing the burden of proof or moving away from the presumption of innocence. I think what we all want is a system where there's robust testing of evidence, where nobody who's innocent is convicted, but also where guilty men are not regularly walking free from our courts. And I think that's what is happening just now.
And there is an issue here about risk, isn't there? If a university does not know about someone's background, then they could be a danger to many students on campus.
Yeah, that's true, and certainly even innocent people sometimes have their liberty restricted, for example, by being remanded prior to trial. But that would generally be on the basis that they have proved in the past that they present a risk. In other words, that they have previous convictions, that they haven't complied with court orders. So I would have no real objection to where the university has that kind of information to make a decision of the type that you're referring to. But generally speaking, the university won't have that information.
Do you believe that Edinburgh University did the right thing here? Because, of course, they took a different approach to Glasgow University, and it's that particular difference that Ms Wilson has an issue with this evening.
What I think is, if they had been challenged, if they had expelled the student and they had been legally challenged in relation to it, it would have been very difficult for them to justify that decision when we operate a presumption of innocence in Scotland.
Sandy, what is your view of that, the different approach from the two institutions?
I mean, I don't want to come in and present one university as right and another as wrong, because I think there are issues across all our universities and how they respond, and most universities I'm aware of are really endeavouring to improve their processes here. But I think that I am very uncomfortable with the idea of somebody has been charged with rape and they can simply move educational institutions in the way that seems to have happened in this case. I do think Ms Wilson's point was a really, really good one about what about the students and the safety of the students at the institution that this person who's been charged with rape is moving to. And I think there does need to be a balance of rights here, and it maybe feels in this case that the rights of the person who'd been charged with rape were the ones that were given priority, and I'm not sure that that's the appropriate course of action in these circumstances.
Sandy Brindley from Rape Crisis Scotland and Thomas Ross Casey, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, Rishi